Okay, so thank you for that introduction, Vajrachaksu, and it's very good to, so to speak, be back with you again. I was virtually here about 3 months ago, maybe for an evening, and how lovely to see people again and to see a blue sky. It's behind. Oh, there it is, because here it's very grey and wet. And yes, I have a long history with our Triratna movement and a long history with Sangharakshita. I made my first contact at the end of 1970. And in those days, Triratna, which is now, we call it a movement with centers and retreat centers and businesses and communities all over the world. But when I came along, there were 30 people in a room that had been hired for one evening in London. So it was a very, very small affair. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it's like what you have in Istanbul, or maybe you're even bigger than that now. So yes, I have a lot of memories and not a lot of time. I'm very aware that I could say a lot, but I'm going to see, hopefully, if I can not strain your patience too much as I give a little bit of an overview of Sangharakshita, and then, yes, have time to talk among ourselves and answer questions, or whatever questions or comments you want to make afterwards. Okay, so I'm going to start by saying something about Sangharakshita's early life, his very early life. Often when people talk about Sangharakshita, they'll talk about the experience he had when he was 16, when he became a Buddhist. But I think that if you want to understand Sangharakshita, and if you have questions about Sangharakshita, it's worth briefly at least taking into account where he came from, even from childhood. So he was born and lived in London, in a suburb in London. His parents were not very rich, or not rich at all. They were just ordinary kind of working people, not particularly educated, no college education in the family. His father was a carpenter, and happy family, generally happy. He had a sister. But at the age of around 7 or 8, he had a condition, a health condition, which was diagnosed as a heart condition. And the doctor said that he had to stay in bed and not move. Sometimes he would be tied to the bed, literally tied to the bed. And he was in that position for 2 years. So from the ages of something like 7 to 9. He spent that time entirely in bed, and all he could do was read. And at first, as a child, his father brought him comic books. I don't know if you understand what I mean, with pictures and bubbles. But by the time he left this period of being in bed, he was reading all the literature of from English history, literature, poetry. As well as reading the works of literature from beyond Britain. He was an avid reader, reading several books a week. He just did nothing but read, and loved acquiring information and education and knowledge. He became inevitably very, very self-aware, very mindful, because he was not allowed to move. He developed a habit of physical mindfulness, which never left him. It was something that he worked on as a Buddhist as well, but even from that early age, he was extremely aware of how he was sitting, how he was using his hands, and living with him, as I've done twice in 2 occasions. You're very, very aware when you are with him of how conscious he was of his movements. And often in relation to him, you could feel very, very, very young and stupid. In relation to him, you would almost feel, by comparison, drunk, because he was so contained, so mindful, so present on that level. He also, I guess, became, by his own admission, an extreme introvert. He said, in a sense, he was almost beyond introversion. He lived in a world of his own, and a world of his own imagination. Reading these books, great books of English literature, of romance, of fantasy, reading poetry, writing poetry as well. He inhabited a world of imagination, which again, I think, never left him. He had an extraordinarily clear mind. If you're at all interested in astrology, I'll just mention that he was a double Virgo. That doesn't mean a lot to me, but I know it means a lot to some people. So he had that kind of mind, but also a mind that was really fast to live within a world of symbol and archetype and imagination from this very, very early age. Somewhere around the age of 13, he was back at school, but they had to put him into, when he came back to school, they had to put him into a different school, a better school, and also to put him into a year several years older than his own age, because he was just so far advanced of all the children who'd merely been at school. But because he'd educated himself so thoroughly, he was moved several years ahead and spent his life around much older boys. So again, something to bear in mind when thinking of Sangharakshita, that he didn't have a normal process of just learning how to be a person among other people. He didn't grow up among peers. In a sense, it was quite an exceptional childhood. In some ways lonely, though you get the impression that his books and his imagination was enough for him. He wasn't unfriendly. You get the impression that when he joined a boys' organization like the Boy Scouts. I don't know what the equivalent is in Turkey. And made friendships and was perfectly happy among other boys, but he hadn't had the normal process of what sociologists would call socialization, of just becoming a person and knowing how to do life like other people. So he inhabited quite a refined world. Somewhere within that as well, he just realized gradually that as he became adolescent, he was more interested in boys, both emotionally and sexually, than he was in girls, though he did have a romantic infatuation with a girl when he got a job, in his first job. But, and of course, homosexuality was illegal in those days in England. So it was something he never talked about, but nor did he feel at all guilty about it. He never acted on it. There was never an opportunity in his world to act on it. It was just something he was aware of, which he carried with him. So when he was 16, and here we come to this important milestone in his life, by then he was reading religious literature. He was interested in religion, though he wasn't a Christian. He would go to church with his parents, and he was very, he loved the literature, he loved the language of the English translation of the Bible, but he wasn't particularly a Christian. But when he was at the age of 16, he read some books, and one of those books absolutely convinced him that he wasn't a Christian. Not just that he wasn't a Christian, but even though he'd not particularly been drawn to Christianity, he felt very, very powerfully liberated from whatever Christian conditioning that there was in him. It was a very profound, almost explosive experience of liberation. And then soon afterwards, reading, two extraordinary Buddhist books that you might be aware of, the Diamond Sutra, the Vajracchedika Sutra, and what's often translated as the Sutra of Hui Neng. These are not simple books. These are not beginner's books. I still don't understand the Diamond Sutra. It doesn't really mean when I read it, I can enjoy and experience some of it. I'm lost on it. But at the age of 16, he picked up the Diamond Sutra and immediately had a profound experience. He just knew what it was saying. It spoke to him absolutely directly. And he knew, as he often would say, he knew he was a Buddhist, and he knew he always had been a Buddhist. Something very deep inside him just resonated absolutely with what that sutra was saying, even though the whole point of that sutra is to demonstrate that you can't put that into words. So he had a wordless insight experience through the medium of these very cryptic, difficult words in the sutra, which just convinced him that he knew what the Buddha was saying. He got it, and he was a Buddhist, and that was his. In a way, I think he already knew that this was his destiny. That this was what his life was to be about. It's maybe worth saying that there was nothing in his life up to then, apart from a grandmother who had a couple of Buddhist ornaments in her house, a couple of a painting and a little statue of the Buddha in her house. But that was it. It's not as if he had some big Buddhist background. So there he is at the age of 16, and of course, in the wake of this experience, reads more and more about religious, particularly mystical writing, not just Buddhist. He reads the Tao Te Ching in 8 translations, and the Quran in 3 translations, just to give you an idea of the kind of boy he was. Always remember, this is a very young boy, but also he's reading a lot of Buddhist literature, and at the age of 18, wrote an article for the only English language Buddhist magazine, which is called The Unity of Buddhism. And it's worth mentioning because, well, for an 18-year-old to write an essay that gets published is good, but in that essay, he makes the point that, and here he's talking particularly to an English audience, an English Western audience, but this might apply more broadly. He says that people in Britain are simply not able to understand Buddhism. Firstly, because there simply isn't enough of it translated, and most people haven't read what is available. So they have a very, very narrow picture of just one little bit of Buddhism. But also, people in England are either Christian or they're secular and scientific, and then they'll either reject Buddhism because it's not Christianity, or they'll reject anything in Buddhism that is not strictly rational. So they'll be attracted to the very rational, almost scientific side of Buddhism, the morality and some of the philosophy, but they won't really understand the heart message of Buddhism. This is an 18-year-old making this declaration, which, if you read it, it is almost a manifesto already. You can almost see Triratna in that article. The principles underlying Triratna are already there in that article. He had got it that Buddhism is a sort of a total tradition that comes out of a single quality of experience, which the Buddha had, the Buddha saw. And already uniquely, even then and at that age, he was kind of pioneering what obviously is a necessary approach to the Dharma for us in the West, because when we learn the Dharma, we don't just learn it from one monk who comes to our village and then moves on. We have the world of Buddhism at our disposal in books, in the internet, in Tibetan and Burmese and Vietnamese people who are coming to our countries, and so on. To add to just the issues of his childhood, a war broke out, a world war, So this was something else. And he was, as a young boy, this was when he was 15 or 16, he was evacuated to a remote part of Britain that was safe from bombing. And he stayed there for a while, but found a library and carried on reading, and then got conscripted into the army. And just as a little side fact, it's kind of worth noticing that while he was in the army, and this was near London, he was his training, he came home to see his parents on a Sunday to have lunch with them. And when he came into the street where his parents lived, where his house was now a hole in the ground. A bomb had destroyed the house that morning. None of his family were there at the time. Usually they would be, but none of them were there. And the house was destroyed. He climbed over the wreckage and saved 600 of the 1,000 books he already owned. This is as well as going to the library. Again, it just gives us an idea of this really very exceptional young man. So he was 16, and by then he was 18. He was in the army. He was posted miraculously, from his point of view, to India. This was 1944. It was moving towards the end of the Second World War. And he was in the army with very little to do. He was a Morse code operator. You know what Morse code? Tap, tap, tap. Apparently very fast. Apparently very, very good at it. But yeah, there was very little work, and very close, there was a Hindu ashram, and he would spend time with the Ramakrishna mission monks, the Advaita non-dual Hindus, talking to them about Hindu philosophy and reading the books in their library. And when the war ended, for 3 years, he spent his time almost entirely in a Hindu environment. India obviously is Hindu, but as you know, or ought to know, is Buddhism didn't really exist in India. Buddhism had died out hundreds of years before, so there was very, very little Buddhism in India. Many of the pilgrimage spots were completely overgrown, had been reclaimed by the jungle, and so if you met Buddhist monks, they came from Burma or Sri Lanka or some other country. There were very few, if any, Indian Buddhist monks. He spent some time with people from the Mahabodhi Society, but in terms of his spiritual instincts, he found much more nourishment among the sort of the profoundly practicing Hindu swamis. He did not like Hinduism as an institutional religion. He was repelled by the caste system. He was repelled even then by the practice of untouchability and many aspects of Hindu life. But a lot of the monks and swamis he met, particularly through the Ramakrishna mission, were very, very impressive. They seemed to be living a spiritual life. And again, I think it's worth bearing in mind that this very, very bookish young man, although he was convinced he was a Buddhist, he'd not ever meditated. He hadn't, as it were, lived it. He'd not practiced it. Why would he? Where would you learn this? In London in 1940. So for him, meeting the swamis, these Hindu swamis, made him realize that this was something you could live, something you could practice, that it wasn't just a matter of nurturing an experience and reading about it and relating to it in that way. Unfortunately, the Buddhists he met very rarely impressed him. He once told me, not long after my ordination, we were on retreat together, and he just said, if anything would have put me off becoming a Buddhist, it was the Buddhists I met. for those first years. It was really that bad. And it is interesting when you read his memoirs, and I hope you will, because they're a very good read. Sometimes you think, well, why didn't he just stay with the Hindus? Because they impressed him more than the Buddhists for a very long time. But he says again and again that he never lost his conviction that he was a Buddhist and that his path was a Buddhist path. But there he was, and he took nourishment where he could find it. So yes, for 3 years, he traveled in India. He and a friend, an Indian Hindu friend, traveled often together. First of all, they soon after he left the army, he and his friend, who was also wanting to be a Buddhist, and well, again, the assumption was that if you do Buddhism, you have to be a monk. That was his assumption. So he wanted to be a monk, and the obvious place to become a monk would be in Sri Lanka, because there was a living Buddhist world in Sri Lanka. So he and his friend went all the way from Calcutta and up northeast India, all the way down to the south, and got a ferry to Sri Lanka. And well, they'd made the mistake of burning all their paperwork. He had no passport. He had given away his watch. After leaving the army, him and his friends, very young, idealistic, they wanted to be wandering holy men. And so they had got rid of all their identity, but still went to Sri Lanka expecting to be let into the country, very naive. And at the docks, at the port, they were just told to get on the boat again and go back to India. So he spent the next 2 years, I think, with his friend, walking a lot of the way, just traveling all the way back to the north of India, stopping sometimes with some of the great world-famous Hindu teachers like Ananda Mahima, a woman saint, Ram Dass, and probably in England at least the most well-known would be Ramana Maharshi, because several of his books have been published, or books of question and answer sessions with him have been published into English at least. And he spent time with these teachers, met many strange, eccentric, wonderful, colorful teachers. And eventually, and by way of a long journey with many entertaining encounters, he and his friends were ordained as Buddhist monks in Lumbini, the place where the Buddha died. Sorry, in Kusinara, the place where the Buddha died. And by then, I think he was something like 23 years old. Finally, he was a Buddhist monk. So his heart's wish to be a Buddhist monk was granted. He'd come quite a long way, but he had no teacher. He was still freelance. The man who ordained him had a tiny little monastery. He couldn't afford to take on another student and to support him. So, the wanderings continued until a monk, a scholar and a monk at the Hindu University in Benares, Jagdish Kashyap, said, well, he would take him in. And he spent a really fruitful period of time with this incredibly fat, enormous Hindu monk, just only the two of them living in this house in the grounds of the university. And Sangharakshita studied logic, Buddhist philosophy, and Western philosophy, and just had this expert, a monk professor on tap. And he would just knock on his door. This fat monk would be just lying on his bed most of the time. And he'd ask him a question, the monk would answer it, and he'd go back in his room and carry on. During this time, he was also writing for magazines, and I think clarifying his thinking about the difference between the the essence of Hinduism, and the essence of Buddhism. I think in that period he was doing important work of clarifying how he talked about the Dharma, even to himself. But this little period came to an end after a little bit of travel with this monk. The monk took him to this little town on the border between India and Tibet, Bhutan, Sikkim, this really important town in a kind of crossroads, between these different worlds, a trading town. Very, very much a kind of Tibetan world, Nepali Tibetan, some Indians, but it's just on the edge of the Himalayas, already in the foothills of the Himalayas. And Jagdish Kashyap, his teacher, said, look, I want you to stay here and work for the good of Buddhism. And with that, the monk disappeared. I sometimes wonder whether those questions that Sangharakshita kept asking him, had got a little bit wearing, and this very, very kind, generous monk just wanted a quieter life. Something that Sangharakshita had got him to realize was that it's possible to go around begging. This was something that Sangharakshita had been doing with his friend for a long time. And Jagdish Kashyap, the teacher who lived in a university establishment, he did have a meditation practice. And of course, by now, Sangharakshita had an established meditation practice. But Jagdish Kashyap, in a way, rediscovered what it was to be a free, wandering monk. And so he left Sangharakshita in this town, Kalimpong, and went off begging to go off and find somewhere to live and meditate and give up the academic life. So I think Sangharakshita probably had a profound effect on him as well. Altogether, Sangharakshita spent 14 years in this town, Kalimpong. And it was a very, very different world, obviously not a Hindu world. The main religion that you'd bump into in Kalimpong, apart from Tibetan Buddhism, would be the Christian missionaries who ran and still do run many, many schools. I've been in Kalimpong, and in the morning, in all directions, you see children in very crisp uniforms going to school in different ways. And they're all going to schools founded by Christian missionaries. And it's a very, very strong missionary drive among the Christians in that area. There certainly was, and there was when I visited in 1982. The children who looked happiest when I was there, no question, went to a different school, a very small, very underfunded school run by a Tibetan Lama. And this was the ITBCI school. You don't need to know what that stands for. Dada Rinpoche was probably the closest friend that Dante had, possibly, in his spiritual life, as a teacher and as a friend. I'd heard many stories about Dada Rinpoche before I went, and when I woke up in the morning, I'd arrived in Kalimpong at night. I spent a night in a hotel, and then it was time to try and find this school. And everywhere I looked, there were children. People never understood my accent, no matter how hard I tried. And in the end, I saw these children who were laughing and smiling in a way none of the other children were. And I just went up to one of them, or a little group of them, and said, Dada Rinpoche. And they immediately laughed and took my hands and took me to the school. It was that obvious, that this wonderful, wonderful man, who at the time I met him was 65, but looked much older, just ran this school, and for all these years had lots of time with Sangharakshita. They would work together on translations. They would work together on meditations. What he said to me were two things which are worth communicating. One was that Sangharakshita had a remarkably profound ability to grasp the Dharma in a way that no other Westerner that he'd been aware of could, and more than many of his Tibetan disciples. But he said in particular, they became friends. And he found that because they were friends, he could teach Sangharakshita things that he couldn't teach his Tibetan disciples. In his world, he was an incarnate Lama, the 13th incarnation of Dada Rinpoche. He had his own monasteries back in Tibet. So in his world, he was up there in the hierarchy. So that for him, he was an object of devotion, a remote figure for Tibetans. But Sangharakshita and he had a more equal relationship. He was definitely the teacher. But he said, I found it really interesting that because we formed a friendship, I was able to teach him more easily and more quickly than I could teach my Tibetan disciples. So it's just an interesting insight into Dada Rinpoche, but also into Sangharakshita. There were other teachers who passed through Kalimpong, particularly after the Chinese invasion. Many Tibetan refugees were coming through to India, and Kalimpong was the natural staging post, somewhere they'd pass through. And along the way, Sangharakshita had meetings with and got to know and had initiations from some of the leading figures in the Tibetan Buddhist world, from the different areas of the Tibetan Buddhist world. While he was there, he was writing. He never stopped writing. It's worth saying that from childhood, when he was reading, he also was writing. If he read, for example, a very, very long, very well-known poem in the English language, Paradise Lost by John Milton, immediately Sangharakshita tried to write his own poem, his own epic poem, 900 lines, in the style of that poem. He was always writing. He also was painting, something I'd forgotten, but he very nearly went to art college. His parents discussed with him very seriously when he was young the possibility of going to art college. But when his mother realized that this would mean he would see a lot of naked women, they stopped that idea. So instead, he had a different life. But otherwise, we might be seeing his paintings in art galleries, who knows? But in Kalimpong, he was writing, editing magazines as well, and writing for magazines that he edited, and meeting a lot of Buddhist writers and thinkers through his connection through the magazines, which was again an important sort of area of input in his life. During that time, he was also writing, his first major book, A Survey of Buddhism, which I imagine do you have that in Turkish? Oh, you don't yet. Oh, well, you will. And somebody who, a monk that I once met, when talking about this book, said that that book gives you the key to the entire Buddhist tradition. Again, like that article he wrote when he was 18, the survey which he wrote when he was about 28, covers the whole Buddhist tradition, from very basic Dharma, what the Buddha was teaching in the foundation, what are the foundations, and then exploring how the Buddhist tradition developed and evolved over the centuries, but all from the same root. So again, that book is like a key, and again, I would argue a manifesto for how Sangharakshita wanted people to engage with Buddhism as an organic totality, serving different aspects of human nature through its different developments. During that time, he was just thinking a lot about Buddhism, about the Buddhism he met in India, about the narrow orthodoxies that he often encountered. For him, it was really important to understand not just the letter of the teaching, but as deeply as he could, the spirit of it. During the rainy season, he would read and just walk backwards and forwards on the veranda of his home, just trying to work out, well, what do those words have to do with practicing the spiritual life? Yes. Yeah, maybe that gives you enough of a sense. Just one last thing about his life in Kalimpong. He established a very small vihara monastery, which in fact the Dalai Lama visited and consecrated for him. And it was called the Triratna Buddhist Vihara, and it was dedicated not to any one segment of the Buddhist sect, but to all three yanas, all the three developments, the so-called Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana, that he wanted through that monastery people to get this overview and to be able to use the riches of the entire Buddhist tradition. But then fate stepped in and he was invited to England. There was some tension in the very, very tiny Buddhist world in England. It couldn't have been more than, a club, 200 people maybe involved in Buddhism all throughout the country, but they were already arguing with each other. And because he was the most senior Buddhist monk of English origin, he was invited for a visit to this establishment in London, which was like a small vihara. He was living with 2 or 3 other monks from the East and expected to live, just the proper life of a monk while he was there and do some teaching. But if you look at the lectures he gave in that time, and you can still hear some of them if you understand English, obviously, already he was thinking about what is it, what does the West need? What does the modern world need to understand the Dharma? How do you talk about the Dharma? How do you communicate the Buddha's message, the Buddha's vision, in a language or in terms that people in the modern world, which was in fact becoming quite global, will understand? Just seeing him playing with ideas, trying things out, again, giving this overview of the whole tradition, bringing ideas like Buddhism as a path of evolution, of higher evolution, the possibility of taking what nature has given us, particularly in terms of self-awareness, that with that capacity, it's possible to take control of our own individual higher development, to an infinite degree. So he was exploring that kind of language to put across, Buddhism as well as teaching a lot of basic Buddhism. So yeah, if you go onto the website Free Buddhist Audio, you can see lectures, a few lectures that he gave in, I think, 1964, 1965, during this period of his life. Now, he was no longer in India. He was no longer living kind of in a world where there were very definite social conventions and conventions around being a monk and so on. And he was thinking deeply about how do you communicate Buddhism in the West? And so, he started having what, at the time would have been very radical thoughts, like, why do I wear robes? I'm not begging my food. Nobody here understands robes. If anything, they think I'm, some exotic, alien. So he just experimented with not wearing his robes all the time. If he was teaching or if he was in the vihara with the other monks, but if he was out in the streets, he would wear ordinary clothes. He started to let his hair grow. And he formed also a very strong friendship with a man of about his own age, a little bit younger, a man who worked in advertising, who came to his lectures, who had a sort of very strong spiritual intuition, but had he wasn't a Buddhist or anything in particular, but he had a real feeling for something out there, something transcendent. He also suffered from profound bipolar disorder, depression. They became very, very close friends. I look at that time and I think that possibly for Sangharakshita, who'd never really had strong friendships when he was a child, because he was at school with people not his own age and so on. And in India, there'd always been the language differences and the cultural differences. He made friends, good friendships. But I think with this young man, Terry Delamere, he was able to enjoy a quality of sharing himself, of intimacy that had never been possible in his life. And it was very, very important to them both. It was not sexual. I mean, up to this point, Sangharakshita had still never experienced sex. And Terry was not only married, but when I asked Sangharakshita directly whether it was a sexual relationship, he laughed, that Terry was, he said, an absolute out and out ladies' man. That was his, that was where he was. But it was for them both an extremely important friendship. And they would often, Terry had a flat near the Vihara, and often Sangharakshita would go there. They'd talk late into the night. Sangharakshita would stay there. On retreats, they'd go off and just go for long walks together. Some of the time it was just sharing whatever they were sharing. Sometimes Sangharakshita was just trying to help Terry through his depression interludes. But people started to talk, and people started to assume that it was a sexual relationship. And the gossip, the talk became so extreme that when Sangharakshita went back to India to just have another visit to India, because he had decided that he did want to work in England. He assumed he'd still be working within this context of the Vihara in London. But he was excited by the possibility of teaching the Dharma in the West. And so he went back to India to see his teachers, to get their blessing, to say goodbye to friends. And Terry went with him. While he was there, he got a message to just say, you'll no longer be welcome if you come back. He was never told why, but it was pretty obvious. Partly he'd upset some people because of the way he had tried to help them resolve those difficulties that they had, which had brought him over in the first place, but also the level of gossip, the assumption that he was a monk having not just a sexual relationship, but a homosexual sexual relationship was just too much. So he was never directly challenged, so he could never, and he felt it was inappropriate to argue against what was only an assumption. So he never spoke about it. But when he got the letter to say that he would no longer be welcome and they would no longer support him, he felt morally free to come back and start his own Buddhist movement. Now, this wasn't something that he was particularly wanting to do. He told me that really what he would have naturally done was go back to Kalimpong, write novels, write poetry, write books on Buddhism, and meditate. But instead, the opportunity and the need in the West for the kind of Buddhist movement that he thought the world needed was there. So he came back, and this is how Triratna was born. And I'll just say a few things about what he had in mind, which you might be familiar with already. He definitely wanted to create a community that was based in practice, in meditation, in taking the precepts seriously, in living a Buddhist life. It was something to be lived. He was not interested in just creating a society, something with membership that people came and went, just taking a little bit of stimulation, a bit of intellectual stimulation. There was already a Buddhist society. He wanted to create or to make possible a community where people could really meet Buddhists and practice the Dharma together. He wanted there to be an order at the heart of that community, partly because he wanted any power that communities as institutions, inevitably decisions have to be made, money has to be used, all the rest. He wanted the community to have at its heart people who were absolutely, definitely committed to living a Buddhist spiritual life, and that they would be the members of the order, and any ultimate decision making and responsibility would rest in their hands. But he wanted that community to not just be an ordinary Eastern monastic community. He envisaged a community that was neither monastic nor lay. And in a way, that's a challenge that all of us are still facing. How do you live a Buddhist life? Which involves renunciation, which involves, quite a lot of challenges. But you don't just escape into the lifestyle of the monk or the nun. You find a way of doing it, whatever your lifestyle. So if you have a family, if you have a career, as a Buddhist, you still try and work out, how am I a Buddhist parent? How am I a Buddhist IT worker? And so on. That's the challenge that we all face, and that's far more exciting than having a community with monks who just live in a monastery getting fat, and lay people who don't feel any great urgency about their practice. He wanted to stress, that what really matters is commitment. It's not the lifestyle. It's not the superficiality of the lifestyle. The choices we make in our life are important. But what has to be absolutely central is that the life is one that's lived, in the light of a commitment to the principles enshrined in the three jewels of the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. He envisaged a movement that would be completely mixed. He definitely always thought it would be open to men and women, and that the order would be open to men and women, which again in those days, and even still, is quite revolutionary. But he originally envisaged that everything would be mixed, all the activities would be cross-gender. It's interesting, we've developed since then quite a single-sex element, which I'll touch on again in a minute. He definitely wanted a movement that, where people knew the Dharma, they knew the foundational teachings of the Dharma, but he also was very definite that he was going to introduce people to Tibetan Buddhism, Indian Buddhism, all the different strands of the tradition. And so, our sevenfold puja, there's English or Turkish, there's Pali, there's Sanskrit. We study texts from the Pali Theravada world, we study texts from the Mahayana world, the sutras, and so on. And that was always very much his idea, that we would absorb the riches that are available to us now that the world makes this possible from the entire tradition. He wanted to encourage his followers to befriend each other, to make strong friendships. In many Buddhist traditions, you see the teacher as your teacher, and any friends you have, you don't talk about your spiritual life with them. You're sometimes even instructed not to, because what can those people teach you? They'll only confuse you. So only talk to the teacher about your meditation, about your understanding of the Dharma. Sangharakshita didn't want that. He wanted to encourage people to mix and to talk and to learn from each other just as much as they would learn from him or from the books they were reading. He definitely saw that our movement would include devotional practice and ritual. He definitely saw that a spiritual life has to involve and engage our emotional life, not just our intellectual life. And he saw his role in all this as being a kind of bridge. Yes, he came out of the East as a monk and lived that way, very strictly when he was in India. But in the West, he was looking at how he wanted to live. He was a real complex human being, but he was deeply versed in the tradition. And he had lived a spiritual life for a very long time. So obviously, he was the teacher, he was the guide, he was the bridge between our modern world and the world he was now living in, and the traditional world that he'd come out of. So in some way or other, he needed to be available to us as a mentor, as a guide, as a critic, and at the same time, find that way of acting in relation to us and what he was doing that was absolutely authentic to him and the sort of rounded complexity of his nature. I think something else he realized is that doing this was going to call on vast reserves of energy. Everything he'd got, to actually fulfill the wish to create a movement that would survive him, that was bringing the Dharma to the West, to the modern world. I think, when I think about his sex life, somewhere along the line, he realized that he couldn't afford to block any of his energy. He had to be just absolutely real, absolutely himself. After all, living as a monk, it's a very helpful lifestyle, but it's a very restricted lifestyle. In this new world, he needed to be different. And above all, I think he just needed to let himself go, to give himself absolute freedom as well. And I think in the area of sex, which is obviously one of those areas, given how inexperienced he was, he made some serious mistakes. There's no question about it. And I know for a lot of people, I believe there as well as elsewhere, this is something that people struggle with, that he made these mistakes. Some people got hurt. It's not actually that many, but yes, some people got hurt. He was in an area that he wasn't really prepared for. It wasn't the whole of him. It was an aspect of what he did and what happened in that period. And it's unfortunate. But I once asked him, I said, two questions. First of all, I said, given all the gossip about you, all the rumors there were about you, why on earth did you allow yourself to then start doing those things? And he said, well, if people were already thinking, what did I have to lose? So that was his first answer. And he said, but you see, if I had chosen to just stay being a monk, if I'd not done that, if I'd continued to practice chastity, I could have worn my robes, or Triratna would be a totally different movement. And it's true. If I think of myself, I don't think I would have been attracted to a Buddhist movement with a monk leading it, running things in the way a monk would lead them and embodying that kind of a world. So, if I think of my own life, I'm kind of glad, that for me personally, I wasn't hurt by it and I wasn't affected by his sex life. But yes, I think it's without that, probably Triratna wouldn't have attracted me. If he'd been heterosexual, he would have been a rival, and I wouldn't have liked that either. So from my point of view, I have to confess it's never been a problem, though of course, I can see it's been a problem for some people, and I have friends, who were affected by it and who were hurt by it. So it's not something we pretend away, and it's certainly not something we glorify. It's maybe an unfortunate aspect of our history, but at the same time, it's interesting to ponder what might have happened if he hadn't done it. Unfortunately, yes, it came at a price. But for now, that seems to be the way I have my peace with that side of the story. So yes, when I met him, he would wear robes if he was leading a class sometimes, or if he was leading a retreat. Most of the time, not wearing robes. He had very long hair. He was a strange man. He was not normal. In a way, just quite ordinary Englishman, a little eccentric, but you could feel behind that he was always watching and observing. He took things in a way that most people don't. The way I speak to myself is, it was like living around a bigger animal, something a little bit more like a natural force than a human being, but actually in a very ordinary body. You would just feel it sometimes if you were discussing an issue that went into depth. You suddenly realized what was there, what was available. If he talked about the Dharma, if he talked about meditation or insight, you felt he had brought it into the room as something so real, so tangible. These spiritual principles that you read about in books, when he talked about them, you simply believed in them. He just gave you confidence, that this dimension of life was available, was open, was possible. He was very generous, very kind, very tolerant, though as we got older, because remember, many of us, when I got involved, I was 22 when I first met him. A lot of, most of the people around at that time were that age. He was in his mid-40s, maybe moving towards later 40s. He became more challenging in terms of how he would answer questions. If we had a question and answer session, he'd be very challenging about the terms of the way you'd ask the question. He'd really push you to be clear in what you were asking. Whereas a year or two earlier, he'd answered anything. You could say anything and he'd come up with a very good answer. Very, very always just thoughtful. And of course, he had this vast body of knowledge of Buddhism, of Hinduism, of religion in general. So deeply read in religion and literature and history. It would just be a pleasure to listen to him explaining things and talking. Living with him, and I lived twice in communities with him, you were very aware of his mindfulness. You were very aware of his sense of urgency. He didn't waste time. He lived a very kind of definite, regular schedule, waking up at 5, reading and writing poetry, then meditating, then spending the morning writing or editing his work, in the afternoon seeing people, in the evening a bit more editing, and so on. He had his routines. But in following that routine and writing 500 words a day, he created this vast body of memoirs and books. It's just quite remarkable. But he never wasted time. He never wasted thought. He's the only person I know who would put in his diary a time when he would think about something. not just put in a diary when he was going to have coffee with someone, but when would he think about something. I think the turning point, and where I'm coming to the end really, though I'm going right back in time. I got ordained in January 1974, and immediately afterwards, we went into a big room next door to the shrine room and held the first convention of the Western Buddhist Order, as it was called, the Triratna Buddhist Order. 25 of us just sitting on the floor with Sangharakshita in a chair. And for 3 days, we just talked about Dharma issues, but mainly he gave us the idea that he was not going to just be teaching all the time. We had to start thinking of teaching. We had to maybe think even about starting centers ourselves. And over those 3 days, he made us believe in the possibility of creating, a bigger community. These 20, 25, 30 people, as we then were, who just spent all our time with him, doing the classes, leading the retreats. And he kind of even then was handing it over to us. And from then on, he was no longer living in London, but he lived a few hundred miles, about 100 miles away. And he would give talks, he would run study seminars, people would visit him, people would sit at the table with him, and he would communicate with us in that way. Formally through lectures and through his books and so on, and seminars, informally, just over the table at meals, which had a mixed blessing, because of course, if he was just speaking casually over a meal, people would hear what he said and it communicate it to the rest of us, and things got garbled, things got exaggerated. Sometimes what got taught was actually more to do with the preference of the person who was passing it on than Sangharakshita. So we're still ironing out some of the complexity around that in our history. But nevertheless, all these years later, here we are. We have this worldwide movement, and for the rest of his life, he acted very much as the mentor. He was always engaged in our work, reading the accounts of meetings all over the movement, meeting people from all over the world, and doing everything he could to foster the development of our movement, which hopefully is ready in a position to carry on without him. For yes, as we're aware today, he's no longer with us. But 3 years later, we're still here, and hopefully we'll be here for a very long time. But I'll leave it there, so there is time for you to ask questions and so on.